In the quaint town of Shreveport, Louisiana, the church fellowship hall buzzed with an unusual energy one evening. Families, retirees, and curious locals gathered, eager to hear Donald Trump speak. Among the sea of faces sat an 8-year-old girl named Lily, dressed in her best Sunday dress, her small hands gripping her grandmother's old leather Bible, a cherished heirloom passed down through generations. The faded gold lettering on its cover glinted under the hall's soft lights, the pages worn from years of loving use. As the evening progressed, Trump stood at the front of the room, his unmistakable presence filling the modest hall. He spoke of policies, achievements, and the future of America, his signature hand gestures punctuating his words. Yet tonight, there was an unusual air about him. He seemed more subdued than usual, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment. The crowd's energy was tepid, a stark contrast to the electric atmosphere of his typical rallies. People clapped politely and nodded in agreement, but a palpable tension lingered in the air. As Trump spoke, Lily wrestled with a profound question that had echoed in her heart for months. It wasn't a fleeting thought born of childish curiosity. It was a question that had taken root deep within her. She had spent countless nights rehearsing it, scribbling it in her notebook during recess, and murmuring it softly to herself as she lay in bed. The words had become a part of her, and she felt a deep yearning to understand something larger than herself. Finally, as Trump opened the floor for questions, a line quickly formed. Adults eagerly stepped forward, asking about local issues, national policies, and even complimenting his iconic red tie. Lily hesitated, her small frame shrinking further into her seat. But when her mother gave her a gentle nudge, she knew it was her moment. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stood, feeling as though the entire room was focused on her. When her turn finally came, Trump looked down at her, his expression softening. "What's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Lily swallowed hard, gripping her Bible so tightly that her knuckles turned white. With a voice that trembled but refused to break, she asked, "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room fell into an immediate and complete silence. Eyes darted between the girl and Trump, the weight of her question pressing down on everyone like a tangible force. For a man known for his rapid-fire answers, Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Lily, then at the Bible in her hands. Something shifted in his demeanor, a vulnerability that few had seen in him before. After what felt like an eternity, Trump finally spoke, his voice lower and steadier than usual. "That's a big question," he began, his tone almost reflective, "and it's not one I've always had the answer to." The admission surprised many in the audience. Trump, known for his unshakable confidence, was admitting uncertainty in front of a crowd. As he continued, he shared memories of his childhood. "When I was about your age," he said, "my parents took me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." He paused, glancing out at the audience, gauging their reactions. "My father used to tell me that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and sometimes you're afraid you'll fall. But you keep climbing because there's something up there worth reaching for." A faint chuckle rippled through the audience, breaking the tension slightly. Yet Lily remained focused, her eyes fixed on him, waiting for the answer she so desperately sought. Trump leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "But as I got older, life threw a lot of challenges my way. I faced losses, failures, and moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going. In those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes I was angry at him. Other times I thought maybe he'd given up on me altogether." The room remained captivated. This was not the polished rhetoric they were accustomed to hearing. This was something raw, something real. "But I'll tell you this," Trump continued, his voice firming up slightly. "Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was alone, I realized that faith wasn't about always having the answers. It's about believing that even when you don't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work. He glanced back at Lily, whose grip on the Bible had loosened slightly, her wide eyes shimmering under the fluorescent lights. And God, to me, he said slowly, is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not done. He's the one who keeps telling us to climb the ladder, even when it feels like it's going to break. Before the weight of his words could fully sink in, Lily's eyes welled up with tears, and the crowd began murmuring softly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. The tears came quietly at first, a single drop sliding down her cheek as she clutched her grandmother's Bible tighter against her chest. But as Trump's words lingered in the air, her shoulders began to tremble, and the crowd noticed the shift in her emotions. Her mother leaned over instinctively, placing a comforting hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered softly. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness. It was something far deeper. Trump had spoken words she hadn't known she needed to hear, and in doing so, he had touched a part of her young heart that she had long guarded. Sensing her reaction, Trump took a step away from the podium, his face uncharacteristically subdued. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a beautiful name," he said with a faint smile. "You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest ones to answer, and sometimes those questions remind us of what really matters." Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never leaving his. "My grandma used to say that too," she said softly. "She said God is always listening, even when you don't hear him." Trump's expression flickered with something unspoken, a mix of admiration and understanding. He took a deep breath, turning his attention back to the crowd. "You know, this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask. What does God mean to us? It's not an easy question, because it makes us look inward. It makes us face our fears, our doubts, and our flaws." The room was utterly still, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. For a moment, it felt as though Lily wasn't just a little girl with a Bible. She was a symbol of something much bigger. Her courage had shifted the tone of the entire evening, transforming it from a routine town hall into a deeply personal reflection on faith and humanity. Trump continued, his voice steady but softer than before. "We live in a world where we're always looking for answers outside of ourselves. We think power, success, or money will fill the gaps, but they don't. The real answers are the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that make us ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is looking?" He paused, his gaze returning to Lily. "Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily. You're wiser than most adults I know." The crowd erupted into soft applause, but Lily didn't seem to notice. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a look of quiet pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress and looked up at her mother, who smiled back at her with glistening eyes of her own. But as the applause subsided, Trump's tone shifted once more, hinting that this conversation was far from over and that the room was about to be pulled even deeper into his story. The atmosphere grew quieter, as though the air itself was waiting for Trump's next words. He shifted slightly at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd before resting back on Lily. "There was a time I thought I had it all figured out," he began, his voice softer now. "I had ambition, plans, and the drive to succeed. But there was one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I actually had." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The crowd leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. Trump rarely opened a window into his personal life, and now it seemed he was about to. My brother Fred, he continued, was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had a light about him, a goodness that I couldn't quite understand at the time. But Fred struggled. He had his demons, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough. Trump's voice faltered for a brief moment, and he cleared his throat. When he passed away, I was angry at him, angry at myself, and angry at God. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to leave this world so soon. Lily's gaze remained fixed on him, her young face etched with an expression far too wise for her age. Around the room, others looked equally captivated, their expressions a mix of empathy and intrigue. For a long time after that, Trump continued, I turned away from God. I thought if he was real, why would he let that happen? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind? He exhaled deeply, gripping the edge of the podium. But then something changed. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night I saw Fred's face in my mind. He was smiling, this big, goofy smile he used to have, and I heard him say, Don't be angry, Don. You've got work to do. The crowd was silent, the weight of his words pressing on them like a physical presence. Even the crowd was silent, the weight of his words pressing on them like a physical presence. Even the faint sound of cars passing outside seemed to vanish, leaving only Trump's voice and the collective beating of hearts. I realized then, he said, his voice steadying, that faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a reason, even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, Fred's purpose was to teach me that. He turned back to Lily, his expression softening once more. So when you ask me what God means to me, I'll say this. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves, and he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times. As Trump spoke, Lily stood a little taller, clutching her grandmother's Bible with both hands, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Just as the room seemed to settle into the gravity of his story, someone in the audience raised their hand, breaking the silence and pulling everyone's attention in a new direction. A man near the back of the hall stood slowly, his hands still raised. His rugged face, lined with years of hard work, bore a serious expression. Mr. Trump, he said, his words measured and deliberate, I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? The question seemed to catch Trump off guard, but he didn't hesitate for long. He leaned slightly on the podium, his gaze meeting the man's. You know, he began, I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. But it was Lily's voice that broke through next. My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds, she said, her words clear and steady despite her small frame. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. Trump smiled, a genuine, almost tender expression that seemed to transform his usually guarded demeanor. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, he said, and she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see. The conversation breathed new life into the room, and people began to nod, share glances, and whisper quietly to those sitting beside them. What had started as a structured town hall had shifted into something far more personal. a shared reflection on life's challenges, doubts, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, raised her hand next. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice soft but steady. "It's never too late," he said. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you, and sometimes it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it comes back to you." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Around the room, others looked equally moved, some dabbing at their faces with tissues, others simply sitting in reflective silence. As Trump's words settled into the hearts of those present, it became clear that the evening wasn't just about questions and answers anymore. It was about connection, about acknowledging the shared struggles of faith, loss, and redemption. The room felt electric now, not with noise but with a palpable energy of shared vulnerability. People who had come expecting a routine political talk were instead part of something deeply personal. It was as if Lily's simple question had opened a door that no one had dared approach before, and now no one wanted to turn back. Trump straightened his gaze, sweeping the room. "You know," he said, "there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones. The times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what matters." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Trump's voice, so often commanding and unyielding, now carried a humility that struck a chord. He gestured toward Lily. "This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads." Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed. From earlier. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's smile widen just a bit more. Trump's tone grew firmer. "We're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences. But faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing that same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths look." A ripple of applause began, slow at first, but gaining momentum. People stood, clapping not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for the courage it had taken Lily to ask her question, and for the answers it had drawn out of everyone in the room. As the applause subsided, Trump leaned in one last time. "So tonight, I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you, and don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be, because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, before adding, "And if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow, and share it with the people who need it most." The room erupted in applause again, but this time it was punctuated with hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet hope. Lily, now standing with her mother, watched Trump step away from the podium. He walked over to her, kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." Trump stood, giving her a faint smile, before turning back to wave at the crowd as he exited. The room remained alive with chatter, the people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. Lily looked up at her mother. Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she? She asked, her voice soft but determined. Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes. She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed. As the hall slowly emptied, the lingering message was clear. Sometimes, the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find the pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. The evening had transformed not just the atmosphere of the room, but the hearts of those who attended, reminding everyone that faith, in all its complexity, is a journey best traveled together.